was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and as far as I remember, if you go east, you get to Roswell. If you go west, you get to the VLA. There's a desert, white sands. There's lava rocks, the lava canyons. I mean, the whole area is like out of the science fiction stories. So, and there's the rocket museum, right?
Yep.
There's stuff from V2s to Apollo program.
Well, we also have the Atomic Museum because we're pretty close to Trinity. Trinity site's in the neighborhood too.
Trinity site is in the neighborhood. So I mean, is this where science fiction writers should live? I mean,
well, we
like
have a tremendous.
Like the real estate in the Albuquerque, like.
It's also not really expensive, so that helps.
Yeah, most science fiction writers are pretty broke.
Yeah.
But there will be a spaceport
Yeah?
right, that is getting built out there.
Oh
so
yeah, the Virgin.
Yeah.
The
Virgin Spaceport, right?
Virgin Spaceport. I mean, with Branson coming in, like real estate.
And there are rumors. I don't think it's been nailed down that the Tesla plant may come play with us too.
Yeah, the battery plant.
So.
Wow. Okay.
So when you have that much cheap land, good things happen.
Did you ever use anything from like that area?
Yeah, actually we did. With the third book, one of the things we've been doing with the books is kind of cycling in and out new characters to make the world that we're writing in larger. And one of the things we did in the third book was we were looking to say, we haven't actually had anybody from a really unfamiliar culture that we'd like to put somebody in that has a very specific cultural identity and a very idiosyncratic way of moving through the world. And we realized that the thing that we actually knew that we could draw from was being a New Mexican, because nobody's like us.
Actually, what we said was we need a culture that is identifiably third world, and New Mexico was it.
New Mexico's great. I mean, New Mexico it's a very strange place. My mother is an architect and worked in New Mexico her whole career, and she had a quote above her desk from Governor Lew Wallace, which was, "Plans based on experience elsewhere fail in New Mexico."
I love that.
It's also, I think, one of the few places in America where you can catch a hemorrhagic fever. So we've got that going for us.
And bubonic plague.
And bubonic plague.
And we're number 2 in the world for necrotizing fasciitis.
Yeah.
Woohoo!
So let's.
It's what you have. You talk it up.
It's we're setting here. Anyway, we came here because probably most of the room is interested in your work on the Expanse series, which, as has been announced, has been not optioned, but it will be produced by the Sci-Fi Channel. Yep. So we'll talk about that later in our conversation. But I mean, can you tell us briefly, because this has been probably told over and over again, why the Expanse series? So let's start.
Well, before Daniel or after Daniel?
Start with before Daniel. There's so much before me. So.
Yeah, the before Daniel is a friend of mine asked me to help her develop a pitch for an MMORPG. And the Expanse is what I came up with. And you can still see the bones of it in there. At the time, World of Warcraft still ruled the world, and we knew we couldn't compete with them in fantasy. Mm-hmm. So we thought about trying sci-fi, and EVE Online existed, but the limitation of EVE is you can't get out of your spaceship. You're pretty much, your character is a spaceship. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to see if it was possible to do one where you fly around, but you can also get out and have adventures in a human avatar. And so I came up with the idea, and you can see the bones in there because World of Warcraft has 2 factions. We thought, hey, we'll be better, we'll have 3. So we have Earth, Mars, and the OPA would be the 3 factions where you would start the game, and all the various moons and bases were instances where you would go to have adventures. And I put a bunch of time into it, and then turned out one of the people working on it was crazy, and we all sort of just backed away slowly. And then I just had this huge binder full of stuff and decided to play around with it running like a tabletop game in that setting, just to see if the setting worked, if there was anything fun to do there. And that's when Daniel showed up.
And yeah, Ty had moved to Albuquerque, and
Why'd you move to Albuquerque?
My wife did her undergraduate at UNM. Yeah.
because we have a really good architecture program,
Okay,
and it's not really expensive.
Yep.
good plug.
Yeah, and you know, I met Ty because he came into my writers group and my critique group, and I was solemnly enjoined, as was everybody, that this couple was moving to Albuquerque and we should all be nice to them. And so, you know, sure. And it turned out we liked them, so that helped, and we lived like the geographically nearest to them of everybody in the group. And I got into his role-playing game. Mm-hmm. And we played a few nights, and I saw his 3-ring binder. He had a 3-ring binder like that thick, full of all of the world-building stuff and all of the information about the settings. And anytime I asked him a question, he just knew the answer. So I could say, you know, well, we're in this space station. What do the corridors look like? And he could just tell me. And I kind of got into the game to the point that I was like writing him email at 3 a.m. saying, okay, I can understand now I know how we can redo the monetary system so that it works in this, as this political breakdown goes, we can take the debt. And he was like, you know, it's 3 a.m. And what I was thinking was, you know, he's done all the world building. And the world building is not my favorite part. So maybe we could just take that and use it. And so I went to him and said, you know, we should make this a book. And the plan at the time was to do a book and sell it for pizza money and have had a fun adventure.
Nice.
And then we kind of overshot.
Which is always good.
Yeah.
Ty, how did you feel about, you know, like the whole book thing? I mean, was that ever in your plans, or?
As you can see from my job history, I'm a sort of a creature of the moment. I just wander from thing to thing. And so when he said, hey, we should try this, I was like, yeah, okay, I haven't done that yet. Let's try that. And based on my experience, 100% of the time when you write a book, it will be an international bestseller and you'll get a TV show. So that seems like a good thing to do.
So will this stop you from wandering now?
No. I'm a person who gets bored very quickly, so.
Yeah, it's kind of astounding that he's still doing this.
Well, they keep buying more of them.
I know.
I was like 3 and I'm out, and then they're like, no.
6
and
I'm out.
And then 9.
9 and I'm out.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're stuck.
Yeah.
Space operas could last for a long time, right?
You know, it was really...
Epics.
Yes, and yet. When we started writing it, all of our friends were telling us not to. Mm-hmm. Because science fiction has been kind of going through this phase where it like totally didn't sell. And they were saying, oh, you know, what's really selling is fantasy. You should write an epic swords and sorcery fantasy. And it's like, but he didn't do the world building for that, so no.
That was easy.
Yeah.
Fantasy is for hacks.
You guys know he used to work for George R.R. Martin, right? He can say those things. And so, yeah, the expectation going in by a bunch of our peers was that it would fail because it was space opera and because that was not a genre that had an audience anymore. And there have been some reconsideration since then.
And it obviously didn't, but
Yeah.
on the contrary, it has a massive following. Let me read a little bit about Leviathan Wakes. You know, I found some people really enjoyed it. So, Leviathan Wakes manages to star both a world-weary detective and an idealistic space captain with a smart-mouthed love interest and some wisecracking ship's crew in the background. It's also just impossible to stop reading. It's also funny without trying too hard, and thoughtful without being overly constructed or preachy. It's the book I have been looking for every time I picked up a space epic. I just didn't know until I found it. I like that one.
That was sweet.
Nice.
I'm glad
Who
they
wrote
like
that?
So, writing space epics may seem as not the real science fiction, not the highbrow, you know, like...
No, and it's deliberately not.
It is deliberately not.
Yeah.
But that being said, I mean, I think we can agree, the three of us, easily, that like what goes on with the characters and what goes on in the plot, borrows from the world and let us actually see today's world in through a different lens in some respects. So it's not completely isolated from the human experience. Can you perhaps expand a little bit on that?
I mean, I don't remember who said it, but somebody talking about science fiction said every science fiction novel is written about the time that it's written in.
Yes.
So that's why all the science fiction in the 40s and 50s is about invasion of the other with the Red Scare and all of that. The science fiction of the 70s and 80s tended to be sort of post-apocalyptic and so I mean, you don't intend to do those things, I think. I mean, maybe some people do, but we're not that smart. But it's going to sneak in there. We found out after we wrote it that we were writing about WikiLeaks before WikiLeaks happened. Because we actually wrote the book before WikiLeaks, and then everybody's like, "Oh, this book was clearly written about freedom of information." We didn't mean to be about that, but it turned out we kind of were.
Interesting. We should probably open it to the audience. Let's mix in some questions.
So, what science fiction writers do you guys read? And maybe you could divide it up into like classic versus like the newer generation.
So classics, my favorite classic book of all time is Stars My Destination by Alfred Bester. And you can see Stars My Destination all over in the stuff I write. I read it when I was about 11, which was way too young to be reading that book. But it was the perfect time to have it reset my brain. So that my brain now is the version that has been reset by Stars My Destination. In the new stuff, I'm a big John Scalzi fan and have been since the beginning. I like the project he's doing, which is to write old school sci-fi without racism and sexism, which is kind of the same thing I want to be doing. But yeah, probably those two. And it's more horror, but I love Joe Hill's stuff. I guess that's more horror than sci-fi.
Yeah. I grew up, my first kind of science fiction experience was 9 Billion Names of God by Arthur Clarke, which kind of broke my head, and I've never entirely recovered. But I read a lot of Larry Niven. I read a lot of Harry Harrison. I read a lot of Arthur Clarke. I read some Heinlein, but I kind of came to Heinlein too late. By the time you kind of need to hit Heinlein when you're too young to see how it's dated. Because the first Heinlein I read, I was in my 20s, and it was Stranger in a Strange Land, and that was oddly anticlimactic. Having read, heard about how important Heinlein was, to come to that, I was thinking, really? Okay. More recently, I will follow Kim Stanley Robinson pretty much any place he wants to go, and I will hold up Ted Chiang as the best science fiction author. If anybody here has not read the short stories of Ted Chiang, I got something for you. You can thank me later. He has a collection out that I think is The Story of Your Life and Others. Is that the title?
Stories of Your Life
Stories
and Others.
of Your Life and
Yeah.
Others? Yeah. That is literally the best science fiction that has been written.
Yeah. And sort of a bridging between Heinlein and the modern stuff, Joe Haldeman.
Yeah.
One of my favorites.
Joe Haldeman's amazing.
All of his stuff is great.
Go ahead.
You mentioned the world building part, but could you talk a little bit more about how you do collaboration?
Sure. Collaboration is a game and needs to be designed like a game. And because when we started this, I had actually written several novels. I'd like 6 or 7, I don't know. But Ty hadn't written any novels, and so I got to kind of claim authority that I probably didn't actually have and tell him how it all works. And so I could make up rules, and he didn't know they were crap. So I could say things like, chapters are 3,000 words long, which I think is true, but other people think maybe that's a little OCD. That's okay. Ty didn't know better, so he went along with it. And so what we do, at least for Leviathan Wakes, the first one, we did that on Wednesdays because it was Ty's day off. And he would come over to my place, or I'd go to his place, and we'd go through the outline. We had a whole outline of what the book was supposed to be, broken into chapters.
Is it also done collaboratively, or?
Yes, we did that collaboratively. And the thing about the master outline is that it's wrong, and you should just expect that. So we did this outline that was, how it was all going to be, and then every Wednesday, we'd take one chapter for Ty and one chapter for me and outline exactly what was going to happen in those 3,000 words. And I'd write mine, and Ty'd write his, and then we'd swap, and I'd edit his, and he'd edit mine, and we'd put it on the back of the master document. And after about 10 of those, we'd see how the master outline was completely wrong for the rest of them. The first 10 chapters, those were fine, but then that's totally not what happens later, and so we'd redo the outline. And then we'd do about another 10 chapters and see that the last 2/3 we have it completely wrong, and then we'd redo the outline.
In what ways does it change?
Well, lots of different ways. The actions that you think are going to take 5 chapters to really unfold, you do in 2,000 words, and then you think, oh shit. And sometimes the characters who you've put in, who you thought were really minor characters, turn out to be really interesting, and you want to spend more time with them.
Exploring it.
And they have something to say about the plot that you weren't expecting to have a graceful way to say, and then you have a graceful way to say it, so you're going to do that. I mean, we have friends who are very into just exploring the text as you go and not really having that hard plan because they feel like it takes away the spontaneity of writing. That is not our experience.
And should I take anything out of the fact that was the most non-collaborative answer that I've ever seen?
No, we just,
He didn't say a word.
You want to say something?
Yeah, what Daniel said, mostly.
There you go. Let me actually. So Ty, what did you teach Daniel in this whole process?
Well, I started out teaching him what the world looks like, and
The constructed world or this world?
both probably. He was shockingly naive when I went to work with him. But the constructed world, but also helping him find the voice that Jimmy needed to have. I think one of the stories he didn't tell about when we first started is he actually wrote the prologue in the first chapter, and the voice was all wrong. And I don't know how I knew that, but I knew in my head it was the wrong voice. So I rewrote them, and then he wrote the second chapter, and we alternated from there on out. But sort of jointly targeting in on what that voice was supposed to be like, because Daniel had done almost entirely epic fantasy up to that point, and there's a voice that works in epic fantasy that is not. We call him Jimmy, the pen name, but it's not Jimmy's voice. Jimmy has a different voice than that. Jimmy is much more sort of that 70s sci-fi kind of just to the point. Here's what happened. Here's just simple declarative sentences. Not a lot of purple prose.
I was going to say pacing and action.
And pacing and action.
I think we're not my strong suits going in.
Well, so Daniel has this thing where, and he'll be the first to admit it, so I'm not telling tales about him, where when he's working on his own, he tends to write his way into books. So the first, I don't know, what would you say, like 20% of a book, somewhere in that
Is
ballpark?
set up and
and he's figuring out what the book's going to be about by writing it. I replace all of that with explosions. So even in the project, his fantasy project he's working on now, I helped him sort of with some of the early world building, and I read some of the early stuff, and I would say, okay, so you have this part here, and it's beautifully written, and it's people thinking about their place in the world and thinking about their lives, and maybe you should replace it with a sword fight. So yeah, definitely in pacing, it's different. And what's interesting is this new epic fantasy series, which is great, reads more like our joint project than like his first solo project. I think if he taught me that chapters are 3,000 words and how to write a novel, I think maybe I taught him how to write more sword fights or something.
Interesting.
So maybe this is a question for Ty about the world building. given that this is more like hard science fiction where things are, I mean, the science is real. How did that affect the world? I mean, like, were there things that you wanted to do where you did research and you're like, oh, no, not possible, not plausible?
No, I never let facts get in the way of awesome. But people claim that it's hard science fiction, but it's actually not. You buy plausibility so cheaply. We have gravity work the way that gravity actually works, and just by doing that, people are like, oh, it's hard sci-fi. I mean, it really is cheap stuff. I mean, I did some research on how they think fusion reactors will work, and just said, yeah, okay, they work that way. I did some research on one theoretical engine design, super theoretical, that would get rid of the heat. So the problem with constant thrust in spaceships is you burn through all your fuel and really quickly, and you heat the ship up too much. So there was this one design, somebody was theorizing that you would actually use the heat to conserve fuel, and so I just pretended that works, and we called it the Epstein Drive. But we're never going to explain what that is, because any minute now somebody will realize that doesn't actually work, and then we'll look stupid. So what we mostly do is just take the really easy stuff like gravity and put it in there, and then people think it's harder than it is. But to answer your question, the cool thing that comes out of that is the few things that you do keep, like we keep light delay. Those don't actually become hindrances, they become plot points. Because it's really interesting when somebody desperately needs to talk to somebody else and they have to wait an hour and a half for an answer. Because that's not our experience now. I call you on the phone, and then at most the delay is going to be like 1/10 of a second, even when I'm talking to you across the world. When we have characters who desperately need information and they're sending a request for that information, and then you wait. And I just picture it like the little spinning ball on your screen. Like, okay, it's 3 hours until I can get an answer back from this. And it's cool when ships take a while to get somewhere. I desperately need to get here and solve this problem, and 3 weeks from now I'll be there. Those become cool plot points that actually come out of trying to keep it at least a little plausibly realistic. Daniel calls it Wikipedia level plausibility, which is pretty much what we're shooting for.
You need a standard.
So my turn, I guess. One of the things that I really loved about the books was that every time I picked up a new one, it was like the story was completely fresh. You started with brand new people, and it was like it was a whole new book, and yet you got pulled into wherever you left off the last book. So what I was wondering was about the series that's going to come out on Sci-Fi. Is it going to be sort of like Game of Thrones, where you're going to do the first series is the first book, and then the second series will start fresh, just like the second book did? That was really a lovely thing about the series, I thought.
This is the part where if we say the wrong thing, ninjas come down from the ceiling and kill us.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. No, that's a fair question. I know the answer to that question, and I cannot tell you the answer to that question, but I can say that the answer to that question makes me very happy.
Excellent. Okay.
So actually, let me interject here. So the technical reason we're here today, let's not forget that, okay, is the latest book in the series. Help me with the pronunciation. Is it Nebula Award? Right?
Nebula.
Nebula.
So you have books in the back, so they are at the subsidized price as well. What can you tell us about the latest installment without divulging?
With all the spoilers? Well, turns out
with all the spoilers. Yeah.
Turns out they're all
Let me actually
unicorns
read what I
and
found about
raccoons.
the book.
Go for it.
I'm sure you will be interested as well. So there are many points. POWs, not POWs. There are many points of
prisoners of
views
war
in Nebula Award. But it does my favorite thing when it comes to stories like this. It connects them all and tells an interwoven story, sort of like a massive four-sided Venn diagram. Nebula Award also brings back one of the best parts about this series, the delicate politics between the inner and outer planets. The politics and the alien horror mystery elements are blended well, giving us a very interesting storyline to follow. Another huge thing that I like about this series is that they get the biology right. Most science fiction focus on physics or mathematics and then butcher the biology parts. This doesn't. This is the science fiction series you need to be currently reading. How about that?
That's nice. I'm glad they thought so.
Nice of them to say.
Nice.
Yeah.
I'm glad we didn't butcher the biology.
So the one degree we have between us is Daniel has a degree in biology. So we like to put biology into the books because it's the one thing we kind of know about. Yeah, so that's why we get the. And again, Wikipedia level plausibility. The thing we got right is that not everything uses DNA as its stable replicator strands. So just that.
Well, we did that, and we have some of the chirality works the way the chirality works, and the idea of things evolving over several different iterations, like flight. There's more than one time that flight evolved because it's just a good idea.
Yeah.
And sight. That kind of censoring.
It's the one Dawkins calls good moves in design space.
Well, it's not Dawkins, it's Dennett.
Dennett, thank you.
Interestingly enough, yesterday on KQED there was a talk about the electric fish, and they evolved 5 or 6 times during the evolution. I mean, it's a good idea, and it keeps re-evolving even if the species gets
eyes are really
decimated.
useful. So eyes have shown up a bunch of different times. Wings are really useful. Wings have shown up a bunch of different times. It's amazing the number of times poison has evolved in totally separate species as a defense or an attack. That some things just work. And then the other one that we used is the fact that depending on your evolutionary tree, what might be somebody's vital protein is deadly poison for you. And the odds of those things perfectly overlapping in any 2 separately evolving biologies is pretty much nil. So things like, the stinging insects that sting you in Cibola just fall over dead immediately after they sting you. Because
Aha, I've taken your blood. Oh, crap.
yeah, your blood is full of poison. Just little things like that can make it seem like, we say, the Wikipedia level plausibility.
And as I said, world building is not my favorite thing to do. So the fact that I'd spent 4 years learning this stuff means I can just mine that and I don't do any additional research. So that's nice.
So I don't know if you face this issue, but a lot of books which have multiple authors have trouble reconciling the different writing styles of the different authors. So what steps did you take to ensure that your writing style was uniform and consistent across chapters and across books?
None.
We got really lucky. But it's not true. We did get really lucky, but we also spent a lot of time at the front of the project talking about what exactly we were trying to achieve with it. And one of the things that's been really interesting, we've been in LA for the last few weeks working on the TV show, and one of the things that's really interesting about the horror stories we hear about other projects that have gone off the rails is the degree to which the problem is people don't agree what they're doing. So we had one example, which I will take all the serial numbers off. There was a project where they went in thinking it was a gritty police procedural until somebody with power came in and thought it was a buddy cop comedy. And when you have people working at different projects on the same project, you're kind of boned. We spent a lot of time agreeing what it was we were writing, and that actually informs a lot of the aesthetic decisions within the page.
And at a tactical level, a part of what it is that we edit each other's chapters. Yeah. So we both write a chapter, we swap them, I edit his, he edits mine, and I think that's where Jimmy's voice comes from, is I sand off all the edges that don't sound like Jimmy in his chapter, and he sands off all the ones that don't sound like Jimmy in my chapter. And we actually re-edit the book 2 or 3 times before it actually goes out to the publisher. And by the time that's done, we've both tinkered with it enough that it becomes hard to tell who wrote which sentence.
We were having an argument last night because we were looking at one of the things you can find when a book comes out is what people are highlighting. And we were saying, okay, they really like this quote. Who wrote that? Well, it's in my chapter, but it doesn't sound like me. So I think that maybe when you added, and we don't know. We don't know who wrote what.
Yeah.
So my question is, did writing any part of the Expanse series send you to emotional extremes, make you gleeful or make you cry? And if so, which parts?
There were some parts I struggled with. Specifically, the hard part was Ty really had to talk me into killing some people one time and another. There were some people I really didn't want to kill. And I was like, but we could do it this way. And he's like, nope, you're wimping out. And it's like, yes, I am wimping out. All right. And had to just suck it up and do that. As far as gleeful, pretty much any time we're writing Avasarala or Amos, those are just too much fun to do. And there's some really lovely little touching moments. One of the quotes that we were talking about from this one was a kind of aspirational moral statement that one of the characters makes that I can really wish we made as a larger audience, and those get me sometimes. Do you have emotions?
No, I mostly don't. I'm the one who argues for killing people. I really like writing whenever Amos beats somebody up or shoots them. I have to say, Amos is my id. Amos does all the things I would like to be doing, but don't. I joke about this, but in role-playing games, I almost always play like the barbarian with the strength of 20 and the intelligence of 3, because I love simple characters who have one solve for every problem. If the problem is not solved by hitting it with an axe, I'll just wait while you guys do whatever. Well, as soon as you need something hit with an axe, I'm there. And Amos is sort of that guy. He's a hammer. Everything looks like a nail. And it's really kind of freeing and fun to write those guys.
So there was a time, like 70s, 80s, like I grew up reading a lot of science fiction, like the Asimovs and all those guys. And like in the last decade, the media has just shifted over to fantasy. Like everyone talks about George Martin and
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
like even your old The Long Price Quartet and all the fantasy books that you wrote.
Yeah.
And any theories on why that at me? Like the science fiction has like dramatically reduced, at least in terms of
Yes.
mainstream
I
coverage.
have a theory about that, but it's not one that makes me popular with other science fiction writers. I think Daniel agrees with me, which is why we're able to work together. But I think there was a stretch there where science fiction got really punishing to read. It became deeply unpleasant to read, and in fact, there was a sort of movement within science fiction that if you were writing science fiction that was fun or pleasant to read, that you were selling out. And so during that period, science fiction sort of collapsed in on itself and became increasingly about a bunch of guys writing for each other. Daniel compares it to fusion jazz. I'm a fusion jazz fan, he is not. But there's like
He's a musician, I'm not.
there are like
that's related.
12 people in the world who care about fusion jazz, and they all write songs for each other. And unless you're into that scene, you just don't have the vocabulary to understand it. When you're doing a lot of weird time and key changes, it's not pleasant to listen to. It's challenging to listen to. And so you wind up with a bunch of science fiction that was like that, where it became more important to have like this incredibly well thought out, what would happen if this one thing changed and all the societal changes, but we don't care about the characters, we just care about really tearing apart this one idea. And to understand it, you have to have read all the same books I've read, and if you haven't, then you're not gonna get it. And it's no wonder they chased their audience off.
There was actually one fairly influential voice in science fiction who argued unironically that plot got in the way of good science fiction. That what you needed for real science fiction was almost speculative essay rather than story.
Yeah.
And that was a very influential view and is a very influential view. And accessibility isn't seen often as a virtue. It's not something, the idea of reaching out to folks who aren't already really sophisticated with this particular group of expectations and customs is somehow dishonorable.
And meanwhile...
And fantasy didn't do that.
Yeah, I was going to say, meanwhile, the fantasy writers went out and wrote interesting stories about interesting characters doing interesting stuff. And yeah, everybody went and read that. Of course they did. We're kind of hoping to jump on the bandwagon that drags it back the other direction. And to be fair, we weren't the first ones to do it. I mean, I think Old Man's War, John Scalzi's book, was really the first one that said, hey, you know what, maybe we could write about stuff that's fun and interesting and doesn't have to be like, 6 pages where we discuss the math of how this works, which is cool for people who like math, but for the rest of us, it's not that exciting.
So actually, feeding a little bit off the answer that you guys just gave, but then segueing into my question. But so I don't know to the extent to which you were talking about the cyberpunk sort of movement in that answer, but
a lot.
I figured. But one interesting thing that I think runs through cyberpunk and then into your guys' book, which you may have actually picked up from them, is sort of a noir feeling to a certain extent, and I think Miller sort of captures that as sort of like, the tough cop, the guy, the hard-boiled, if you will, sort of aspect to it. And do you guys agree with that characterization? I've read it in certain places, but do you agree with that? And if so, kind of, was that a conscious pickup, or is that you just decided that's how he was?
I got a long one on this one. You want to take it first?
Well, then the noir didn't come from cyberpunk. It came because Daniel's a big fan of noir, and he was writing the Miller chapters. Each of the books kind of steals from one genre or another and marries it to science fiction, and that was sort of the noir version. But the thing with cyberpunk, and I still read Neuromancer periodically. I mean, it's ridiculously dated now, but it's still a great read. I mean, it's funny to me now looking back on it and thinking, like, we have replaced the whole the 3D virtual space where you travel through this 3D space and you interface with data as objects. We've replaced that by typing what we want into Google. Who knew that that's what it was going to be? It was going to be a blank white page with a text bar, and you just say, "Tell me about this," and then every possible answer for that comes up. That sort of destroyed the cyberpunk stuff, and of course they missed all the other things. They missed cell phones.
Missed wireless.
They missed wireless. One of our good friends who wrote some cyberpunk in the 80s, one of his novels, the big plot point at the end is the hackers racing around in a car to find a payphone so they can hack into the internet.
Yeah.
And looking back, that's pretty silly now, but that was the cool thing at the time.
But the beautiful thing about science fiction, what makes science fiction different from other genres, is it doesn't have a basic story. When you read a mystery, you know kind of what you're going to get. Somebody's going to die and somebody's going to figure out what happened. When you read a romance, you kind of know what you're going to get. There's going to be 2 people, and through the course of the book, they're going to fall in love. Or they're going to start in love and die, kind of depending if it's Romeo and Juliet or Pride and Prejudice. If you get a Western, you kind of know what you're in for. If you pick up a science fiction book, you can be getting anything from The Star's My Destination to Philip K. Dick to kind of this post-singularity to this blue-collar science fiction. There isn't a single story that science fiction requires. And so it lets us do this thing where you can say, I'm going to tell my science fiction noir. I'm going to tell my science fiction political thriller. I'm going to tell my science fiction ghost story. I'm going to tell my science fiction Western. They all fit. They're all welcomed within that genre, which is cool.
So I have two questions kind of about your answer to the previous one. The first is, you give the impression each of the books sort of is science fiction married to some other genre. Can you talk about specifically which one you feel is what kind of genre, and then also about things being dated? Do you worry about the stuff, sort of the assumptions you're making about technology, something new arising and not being there, right? Like you just hopefully you write them all fast enough that it won't be a problem.
You can't worry about that. You can't spend any time worrying about that because we're always wrong. Science fiction writers are never right. I mean, Jules Verne, I guess, was right about a couple of things, and Clark guessed about communication satellites and was right. But you read Cyberpunk now, and they were really trying to extrapolate future technology. They were working really hard on it, and they were wrong about everything. Not one thing in those books is right. But it doesn't change the fact that they're good books, that they're enjoyable books to read. I don't think you can spend any time worrying about that because you're just accept that you're going to be wrong and be okay with it. It is fiction.
So what are you going to be wrong? Like in the solar system, like
everything.
The political alliances and all that.
So there is no economic reason to colonize the solar system. We just skate past that. We did it anyway.
And as far as mapping the books to particular genres, Leviathan Wakes is our noir, Caliban's War is our political thriller, Abaddon's Gate is our haunted house story, and Sibylla Byrne is our western.
Okay, I'm going to pose my question as a follow-up to that. Are
All
you
right.
going to have a romance?
We might. We've got 9 more. We've got 9 books total that we're under contract for, and that leaves us a certain amount of leeway for that. We have had romances in the books. We are, however, bitter and cynical men, and our views of how love and sex interrelate may not fit gracefully with that particular set of expectations.
Yeah, we're also happily married, both of us, for like a really long time. And so our version of romance is 2 people get together and they're nice to each other and then they stay nice.
For a very long time.
Which is not really compelling drama.
I have found you, the woman of my dreams. Let's sit on the couch and watch a movie.
Yeah. So
not high conflict.
Not a lot of conflict.
And yet another question. Will we ever see the MMORPG?
That is a question for Alcon Entertainment.
Yeah, one of the things that happens when you get a TV show is you just sell all the rights. They're just gone. Yeah. We get to write books, and then other people who are very smart get to decide what to do with them. So hopefully they will find ways to make that popular and make all of us lots of money.
So let's talk about this show a little bit. Sci-Fi has given a direct-to-series order to an exciting-sounding new project based on an acclaimed sci-fi book series. You can guess which book series is that. The cable network has ordered 10 episodes of The Expanse from Academy Award-nominated screenwriting duo. And the project has been described by Industry Insider as Game of Thrones in space.
Yeah,
not so much because of the specifics of the plot, but because it tells a dramatic, sprawling, grown-up story within a popular fantasy genre that's based on a respected series of novels.
Yeah, in order to be Game of Thrones in space, we would have to have a lot more nudity and beheadings. we're actually really slim on those. Yeah, we have explosions. Not as many explosions in Game of Thrones. We got more than that, and we have more spaceships. I hope. So there are these guys named Mark Fergus and Hawk Ostby, and they wrote things you may have heard of. They wrote a movie called Iron Man. They wrote one called Children of Men, and they're really good at what they do. And they did. We were put together by a producer. Sean Daniel and Jason Brown got them to sign on and write a pilot script for this, and they then shopped it. I know basically nothing about Hollywood. Ty knows a little bit, but we weren't really consulted on a whole lot of the thing. We were trotted out as sort of the, oh, look, and here are the writers, which was apparently useful, which was nice. And a bunch of people were really interested in it, and the people who offered the most money bought it, and that was cool. And in theory, it's gonna see air sometime next year. And there's a whole bunch of stuff we can't say, but it's really cool.
So we know that we can't talk too much about the specific of the show because of the whole yada, yada, yada. But tell me, between the two of you, who is the sort of more visual person, like when writing? Like sort of,
Ty. Ty's totally the one that's more visual.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time thinking about what things look like, which is nice because they, one of the things that's exciting and not secret is that they've asked me to help out a lot with that on the show.
I'd figured out.
Yeah, they've asked for my opinion on a great many of those things and seem to be taking it seriously, so that's very cool.
And the amount of participation we've gotten to have in the process is, as far as I can tell, unprecedented. We've actually been in the writer's room and talking with the showrunners for almost 2 months now. And that's a terrible plan. I mean, writers are cranky, antisocial people, and putting them into the middle of this really complicated social negotiation, generally speaking, I would recommend against it. It's worked out well for us, but as a result, we've gotten to be there for a lot of the work that they've done on how to take the text and take the story and reimagine it for a different medium and for the requirements of that medium. And that's been really cool.
Right.
Dovetailing on this, I have a pet theory that really iconic stories come out of changes in medium. That what persists through all the mediums is like the stuff that will persist a long way. And so I was kind of curious. It sounds like this actually started as an MMORPG, then went to tabletop, then became a novel, and is now going to TV, which is the most medium hops I've ever heard of. So I was wondering if you could tell us about some of the early media hops and what was retained and what dropped and where new things came in.
I can only get into that when you start going from tabletop to novel. So
we didn't get too far in the MMO other than just sort of the world building. When I started running it as a tabletop game, I had to obviously find some rules. In that case, I wound up using the open source D20 modern rules as sort of the skeleton for it, and then made up all my own space rules because the D20 future rules are stupid. That was the big shift there, and there wasn't really a story yet, so I didn't have to change anything story-wise. It was actually in coming up with what the events were for the tabletop game that actually started creating story. And then when Daniel wanted to turn it into a novel, then it has evolved greatly because the things that work in games don't work in novels, or it's not 100%. There's a little sliver on that Venn diagram where it works. So you drop all the stuff that doesn't work, you add a bunch of stuff that does work. We're not going to game Miller being sad in his apartment.
A chapter of my character sits there.
Yeah, and drinks and is sad.
Roll your disconsolate roll.
Yeah,
yes.
right.
You are disconsolate. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's not going to work. And then now, between novel and TV, you're seeing the same sorts of things. Again, in the novel, it works to have Miller sit in his apartment and be sad because we're inside of his head and we get to see all the interesting internal dialogue he's having. That would be a really boring episode of TV, 42 minutes of Detective Miller drinking scotch in his apartment and being sad. So now we're looking for ways, how do you visually dramatize that you've got a guy who's sad? And it's interesting watching that transition.
And to go to your theory, the model that I have for this is translation. and I know only one language, so all of my knowledge of translation comes from reading Douglas Hofstadter. But, you know, but the idea of changing the obstacles that you have in telling the story changes the form of the story. And it can be related, and it can be very close, or it can be more general, what level you're trying to translate on, whether you're trying to translate the exact words or the exact actions or the effect that those actions have, are different sets of solutions to the problem. And so, yeah, intellectually, it's just a fascinating bunch of problems, and it's really cool.
Ty, Daniel, thank you for coming and talking with us. And,
thank you for having us.
Thank you.